The land stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast canvas of amber grass and bleached earth beneath a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Sarah McKenna stood in the doorway of her small cabin, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. The summer heat was relentless, turning the air thick and heavy, making every breath feel like drinking from a furnace. She was 28 years old, though the frontier had aged her in ways that numbers couldn't measure. 9 years she had lived here, on the edge of the New Mexico territory, in a cabin her late husband had started building before consumption had stolen him away in their first winter together. She had finished it herself, log by log, nail by nail, her hands bleeding and blistered until they hardened into something resembling leather. The isolation was complete. Her nearest neighbor had been 15 miles south, but they'd packed up and left 2 summers ago after Apache raids had swept through the valley. Sarah had stayed, stubborn as the Joshua trees that dotted the landscape, their twisted arms reaching toward heaven like petrified prayers. Her days fell into a rhythm as predictable as the sun's arc across the sky. Dawn brought water hauling from the creek a quarter-mile away, her shoulders aching under the weight of the buckets. Morning meant tending her small garden, coaxing beans and squash and corn from the reluctant soil. Afternoon was for mending, sewing, preparing what meager food she had. Evening brought the chickens into their coop, checking for coyote tracks, securing everything that could be secured. Night was for sitting by lamplight, sometimes reading from her mother's old Bible, sometimes just staring at the flame until her eyes burned and sleep finally claimed her. She spoke aloud to herself often, entire conversations conducted with the wind and the silence. Sometimes she sang hymns her mother had taught her, her voice cracking from disuse, echoing off the canyon walls to the east. Sometimes she wept, though she tried not to make a habit of it. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford, like sugar or coffee or hope. The cabin was small but sturdy, one room with a sleeping loft above, a stone fireplace that she'd built herself after watching her husband lay the first few courses. Her rifle hung above the door, always loaded, always within reach. She'd killed 2 rattlesnakes, 1 mountain lion, and more rabbits than she could count with that rifle. She'd never killed a man, though she'd come close once when a drifter had tried his luck at her door. The look in her eyes and the steadiness of her aim had convinced him to move along. Her appearance had changed over the years. The softness that had once characterized her features had been scoured away, replaced by sharp angles and sun-darkened skin. Her hair, once a rich chestnut that she'd worn long and carefully braided, was now kept short and practical, hacked off with her sewing scissors every few months. Her hands were calloused, her arms lean and strong from constant labor. She wore men's trousers most days, having long ago abandoned the pretense of propriety for the practicality of survival. The loneliness was a physical thing, a weight that pressed on her chest at night, making it hard to breathe. She dreamed of conversations, of laughter, of human touch. She woke reaching for her husband, 9 years dead, her arms empty and aching. That afternoon, as she hoed between the corn rows, she noticed the dust on the horizon. At first she thought it might be a dust devil, those small whirlwinds that danced across the flats on hot days. But as she watched, shading her eyes with her hand, she realized it was riders. Many of them. Her heart began to pound. She dropped the hoe and ran for the cabin, grabbing her rifle and checking the load. From the window, she watched them approach, counting as they drew near. 8 riders, moving fast, their horses stretching out in a ground-eating lope. As they came closer, details emerged. They were Indians, that much was clear from their bearing and their horses. Not Apache, she thought, studying their silhouettes. These men sat their horses differently, and as they drew near enough for her to make out details, she saw the distinctive style of their hair, the way they carried themselves. Comanche, she realized with a jolt of fear, so intense it made her hands shake. Lords of the southern plains, warriors so fierce that their very names struck terror into settlers' hearts. They slowed as they approached her cabin, their horses' hooves raising small clouds of dust. Sarah stood in her doorway, rifle raised and aimed at the lead rider, though her arms trembled with more than just the weight of the weapon. The lead rider raised his hand, palm forward, the universal gesture of peace. He was a big man, broader through the shoulders than seemed possible, his chest bare except for a breastplate made of bone and leather. His face was weathered and scarred, his eyes dark and assessing. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the distance between them. "We mean no harm," he called out in heavily accented English. "We seek water. Our horses are spent." Sarah's throat was so dry she could barely speak. "There's a creek a quarter-mile that way," she managed, jerking her chin to the east. "Help yourself and move on." The big man exchanged glances with the riders behind him, then turned back to her. "Your hospitality is noted," he said with what might have been irony. "We will trouble you no further." But as they turned their horses toward the creek, one of the other riders spoke urgently in their own language. The big man responded, and an argument ensued, rapid-fire words that Sarah couldn't understand, but whose meaning she could guess at from their gestures and expressions. They were debating something, and she had a sinking feeling she knew what it was. Finally, the big man turned back to her. "My brother says his horse is lame. It needs rest, not travel. We ask shelter for the night. Nothing more." Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. 8 of them, one of her. If they wanted to take what they wanted, they could do it easily, rifle or no rifle. But something in the way they sat their horses, the way the leader had raised his hand in peace first, the way they'd stopped at her refusal rather than simply riding over her objections, gave her pause. "I've heard stories," she said, her voice harder than she felt, "of what happens when your people visit settlers." The big man's expression didn't change. "And we have heard stories of what happens when settlers visit our lands. Yet here we sit, asking instead of taking." The logic was inescapable. If they meant her harm, they wouldn't be asking permission. Sarah lowered the rifle slightly, though she kept it at the ready. "All right," she said slowly. "You can shelter here tonight. There's a lean-to behind the cabin for your horses. But I'm keeping this rifle close, and I'm a light sleeper." Something that might have been respect flickered across the big man's face. He nodded once, sharply. "That is fair. We will accept your terms." He swung down from his horse in one fluid motion, his feet hitting the ground with a solid thud. "I'm called Najwa," he said. "These are my brothers." Sarah didn't offer her name, and he didn't press. She watched as they led their horses around to the lean-to, noting how they moved with an economy of motion that spoke of lives lived on the edge of survival, just like hers. She kept the rifle in her hands as she watched them unsaddle their horses and tend to the lame one, whose right foreleg was indeed swollen. When they approached the cabin, she held up her hand. "Weapons stay outside," she said firmly. Najwa translated for the others, and though a few looked rebellious, they complied, laying their bows and lances against the cabin wall, along with knives and tomahawks. It was a considerable arsenal, and Sarah felt her stomach clench at the sight of it. These were not peaceful traders or scouts. These were warriors. They filed into her cabin, and suddenly the space that had felt so empty for so long was crowded beyond measure. 8 large men filled every corner, their presence overwhelming. They were all big, all heavily muscled, their bodies bearing the scars of battle and hard living. Some had paint still visible on their faces and chests, faded by sweat and sun. Their hair was long, some braided, some loose, adorned with feathers and beads. Sarah busied herself with building up the fire and putting on a pot of beans she'd been soaking. She had some cornbread for breakfast, and she sliced it thin to make it stretch further. Her hands moved automatically while her mind raced, calculating dangers and possibilities. The warriors settled themselves around her small cabin, some sitting on the floor, some on the 2 rough chairs she'd built. They spoke quietly among themselves in their own language, occasionally glancing at her. She felt the weight of their regard like a physical thing. Najwa seemed to be the leader, though another man, slightly older with gray threading through his long black hair, appeared to hold equal status. This man had a presence about him that commanded attention, something in the way he held himself, the way the others deferred to him. His face was harder than Najwa's, more closed off, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing threats. When the beans were ready, Sarah ladled them into the few bowls she had, along with the cornbread. She handed them out wordlessly, and the men accepted them with nods of thanks. They ate in silence, with an intensity that suggested they'd been traveling hard and long. The gray-haired warrior finished first. He set his bowl down carefully and looked at Sarah for the first time directly. His eyes were startling, darker than night, and in them she saw something that made her breath catch. Not cruelty or violence, but a deep, abiding weariness, a soul-deep exhaustion that mirrored her own. "You live alone here," he said, and it wasn't a question. His English was better than Najwa's, with less accent, suggesting more contact with white settlements. "I do," Sarah said, lifting her chin. "For how long?" 9 years. His eyebrows rose fractionally. "That is a long time to be alone in such a place." "You are married." "I was." "He died, and you stayed." Again, not a question, but something like understanding in his tone. "I had nowhere else to go. This is my home." The warrior studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving over her worn clothing, her calloused hands, the rifle she kept within easy reach. "You are brave," he said finally, "or very stubborn." "Both," Sarah said, and despite herself, despite the situation, she felt a smile tug at the corner of her mouth. Something shifted in the warrior's expression, a softening so slight she might have imagined it. "I'm called Tahoma," he said. "It means thunder." Sarah hesitated, then decided that names were a small price to pay for peace. "Sarah McKenna." "Sarah," he repeated, the syllables strange in his mouth. "You have the eyes of a hawk. Always watching, always ready." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, gathering up the empty bowls and taking them to her water bucket to rinse. She could feel his eyes on her back as she worked, a weight that was somehow different from the casual regard of the other men. It made her skin prickle with awareness. As darkness fell, the warriors settled in for the night. They arranged themselves around the cabin with military precision, some taking first watch while others slept. Sarah climbed up to her sleeping loft, rifle in hand, and lay down fully clothed, her ears straining for any sound that might spell danger. But the night passed quietly. The warriors changed watch twice, moving with barely a whisper of sound. Sarah dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every creak and shift, her hand going to her rifle. But each time, she found the cabin peaceful, the warriors either sleeping or keeping their watch. When dawn came, pale gray light filtering through the cracks in her shutters, Sarah descended from the loft to find Tahoma already awake, sitting by the cold fireplace. The others were still sleeping, sprawled in positions that suggested bone-deep exhaustion. "You did not sleep well," Tahoma observed quietly as she came down the ladder. "Would you in my position?" He considered this, then nodded. "No, you are wise to be cautious. But you need not fear us. We will leave today, and you will have your solitude back." Sarah moved to the fireplace and began building up the fire for coffee and breakfast. "The lame horse," she said. "Is it well enough to travel? We will see in the daylight. If not, we will leave one brother behind to tend it and return for him later." The thought of one of these warriors staying longer made Sarah's stomach clench with anxiety. But there was nothing she could say about it. This was their decision, not hers. As she worked, she became aware of Tahoma watching her with that same intense focus from the night before. It made her self-conscious in a way she hadn't been in years, suddenly aware of how rough her hands were, how short and unkempt her hair, how mannish her clothing. "What?" she finally snapped, turning to face him. "I'm trying to understand," he said thoughtfully, "how a woman survives 9 years alone in such a place. You have no family? No one who would take you in?" "I have a sister back east. She wrote me, years ago, saying I could come stay with her and her husband. But I never went." "Why not?" Sarah paused in her coffee making, staring down at the grounds in her hand. Why hadn't she gone? Pride, partly. Not wanting to be a burden, to be pitted. But more than that, something deeper, something she'd never quite been able to name. "This is my home," she said finally. "My husband and I, we built it together. We had dreams for this place. A ranch, cattle, horses, a family. Her throat tightened. When he died, everyone expected me to give up, to go back east. But I couldn't. If I left, it would be like admitting that all his work, all his dreams, they meant nothing. So I stayed. Tahoma was quiet for a long moment. That is the same reason I fight, he said softly. To honor those who came before. To refuse to let their dreams die. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. He was older than she'd first thought, probably in his early 40s, with deep lines carved around his eyes and mouth. Scars marked his chest and arms, white against his copper skin. But it was his eyes that held her, those dark, fathomless eyes that seemed to carry the weight of worlds. "What are you fighting for?" she asked, though she knew she shouldn't, knew that this conversation was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical threat. "For the old ways," he said simply, "for the freedom to ride where we will, to hunt the buffalo, to live as our fathers and their fathers did. But the world changes whether we will it or not. The white man comes and comes and comes like a river that cannot be stopped. We fight, but we are fighting the tide." There was such weariness in his voice, such bone-deep exhaustion, that Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. This was not the savage warrior of frontier nightmares. This was a man trying to hold onto a dying way of life, fighting a battle he knew he couldn't win. For the same reason, she stayed in her lonely cabin, because to do otherwise would be to betray everything he believed in. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. He looked at her with surprise. "Why? You're not the army. You are not the government that breaks treaties like children breaking sticks." "No, but I'm part of it, aren't I? Part of the tide. You can't stop. My being here in my cabin, it's all part of what's pushing you out." Tahoma studied her for a long moment. "You are honest," he said finally. "That is rare. Most whites do not see us as people, do not think of what their coming costs us. You see, that is something." The other warriors began to stir, and the moment of connection broke. Sarah busied herself with breakfast, laying out what food she had. The warriors ate quickly and efficiently, then went to check on their horses. The lame horse was better, but not well enough for hard travel. After some discussion, it was decided that 2 warriors would stay behind to rest the horse for another day, while the rest would continue on to their destination, a trading post 2 days' ride to the south. Sarah's heart sank. 2 more days of this tension, this strange awareness that had sprung up between her and Tahoma. Because, of course, Tahoma was one of the 2 who would stay. He and a younger warrior named Comanche, who looked barely 20 and seemed to defer to Tahoma in all things. The 6 departing warriors thanked her gravely, offering small gifts, beaded trinkets, and a soft doeskin pouch that they pressed into her hands despite her protests. Then they mounted and rode away, their figures growing smaller against the vast expanse of the prairie. Sarah stood in her doorway, watching them go, feeling the familiar weight of solitude settling back onto her shoulders. But this time it was different because she wasn't alone. Tahoma and Comanche remained, already starting work on repairs around her property without being asked. She watched as Tahoma examined her fence line, noting where posts had rotted and wire had sagged. He said something to Comanche, who nodded and went to fetch tools from their packs. Together they began replacing posts, working with the ease of long practice. Sarah told herself she should protest, should tell them she didn't need their help. But the truth was, those repairs had been on her list for months, maybe years, things she kept putting off because she was only one person and there were only so many hours in a day. So she swallowed her pride and instead brought them water, cool from her well, in a battered tin cup. Tahoma drank deeply, water running down his chin and neck, catching in the hollow of his throat. Sarah watched the movement, then jerked her gaze away, disturbed by the direction of her thoughts. "You don't have to do this," she said, more sharply than she intended. "We are guests," Tahoma said, handing back the cup. "It would be dishonorable to accept your hospitality and give nothing in return." "I didn't exactly offer hospitality. You showed up with 8 warriors and asked for shelter." His mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "And you could have refused. You could have shot at us, driven us away. Instead, you fed us, sheltered us. That is hospitality whether freely given or given from wisdom. Sarah had no answer to that, so she went back to her own work, hauling water and tending her garden. But she found herself glancing over at the two men frequently, watching how they moved, how they worked together with few words but perfect coordination. At midday, she made lunch, slicing up the last of her bacon and frying it with beans. She called them in to eat, and they sat at her table, dwarfing her small chairs. Quinai ate quickly, his eyes downcast, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. But Tahoma ate slowly, thoughtfully, his gaze moving around her cabin, taking in the details of her life. "You built this yourself," he said, gesturing at the stone fireplace with his fork. "After your husband died." "Yes. Is good work. Strong." She felt absurdly pleased by the compliment. "I learned by doing. I made a lot of mistakes. Mistakes are how we learn. A warrior who has never been unhorsed has not fought hard enough." Sarah smiled at that, a real smile this time. Is that Comanche wisdom? It is the wisdom of anyone who has lived long enough to know that perfection is a myth. They fell into a comfortable silence, eating their simple meal. Quinai finished and excused himself, going back outside to continue the work. Sarah began to clear the dishes, but Tahoma remained seated, watching her move around her small cabin. "You remind me of my wife," he said suddenly, and Sarah's hands stilled in the dishwater. She had the same strength, the same stubborn will. She would not bend, not even when bending would have been easier. "What happened to her?" Sarah asked softly, though she could guess the answer from the past tense. "Cholera. 3 years ago. She died with 50 others in our band, including my youngest son." His voice was flat, drained of emotion, the way people talk about tragedies too great to encompass. Sarah turned to face him, her wet hands dripping onto the floor. "I'm so sorry." He nodded acknowledgement of her sympathy. She was a warrior in her own way. She fought until the end. "When I see you, I see that same spirit. The spirit that says, I will not give up, I will not break, no matter what the world throws at me." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, an understanding. They were the same, she and this Comanche warrior. Both stubborn survivors, both clinging to the wreckage of their old lives, because the alternative was to admit defeat. "Why do you stay?" he asked, echoing his earlier question. "Truly, is it really about honoring your husband's memory?" Sarah dried her hands on her apron, thinking about the question. It was something she'd asked herself 1,000 times during the long, lonely nights. "At first, yes," she said slowly. "It was about him, about not letting go of what we'd started together. But as the years went on, it became something else. It became about me, about proving that I could do it, that I was strong enough, capable enough. Every morning I wake up, and I'm still alive, still surviving. That's a victory. Does that make sense?" "Yes," Tahoma said simply. "That makes sense." He rose from the table, his frame seeming to fill the cabin. He was tall, she realized, taller even than her husband had been, with broader shoulders and a presence that was impossible to ignore. As he moved past her toward the door, he paused, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You should not have to fight alone," he said quietly. "No one should." Then he was gone, out the door to rejoin Quinai, leaving Sarah standing in her cabin with her heart pounding and her thoughts in chaos. The afternoon passed in a strange sort of dance. Sarah went about her chores, and the two men went about theirs, but she was always aware of where Tahoma was, what he was doing. She told herself it was caution, keeping track of potential threats. But she knew it was more than that, something she didn't want to name or acknowledge. As evening approached, she shot a rabbit and skinned it, making a stew with the last of her potatoes and some wild onions she'd found by the creek. The smell filled the cabin, rich and savory, and she realized she'd actually taken care with the cooking, had wanted it to be good in a way she hadn't bothered with in years. Quinai ate and then, with a perceptiveness that surprised her, excused himself to go check on the horses, leaving Sarah and Tahoma alone. They sat by the fire as darkness fell, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Tell me about your people," Sarah said, breaking the comfortable silence. I don't know anything, really, except the stories settlers tell, and I have a feeling those aren't the whole truth. Tahoma smiled, a rare expression that transformed his face. No, the stories are rarely the truth. We are not demons, any more than you are angels. We are people, try to live, to survive, to keep our way of life. He told her stories then, in his deep, accented voice. Stories of buffalo hunts on the endless plains, of the freedom of riding for days without seeing boundaries or fences. He told her of his childhood, of learning to ride before he could walk, of the wisdom of the elders and the bravery of the warriors. He told her of ceremonies and celebrations, of seasons turning and the great migrations following the buffalo herds. And as he talked, Sarah realized she was seeing a whole world she'd never known existed, a world that was being destroyed by people like her, by the tide of settlers pushing westward. It filled her with a deep sadness, a sense of loss for something she'd never had but could recognize as precious. "What will you do?" she asked when he fell silent. "When the buffalo are gone, when there's nowhere left to ride free." His face hardened. "We will fight. What else can we do? To stop fighting is to die, to accept the reservations and the broken promises. I have seen the reservation Indians, pinned up like cattle, dependent on government handouts, their spirits broken. I would rather die free than live that way. Even if fighting is futile, even if you know you can't win. Especially then, a man, a people, we're defined not by our victories, but by what we are willing to die for." Sarah thought about her own stubborn determination to stay in this cabin, to survive against all odds. "Understand that," she said softly. "More than you know." Tahoma looked at her, and in his eyes she saw that recognition again, that sense of kinship. "Yes," he said, "I think you do." The fire burned low between them. Quinai returned and spread his blankets near the door, falling asleep almost immediately with the ease of youth. But Tahoma remained sitting with Sarah, neither of them speaking, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Sarah stood, stretching muscles stiff from sitting. "I should get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow will be another long day." "Yes," Tahoma agreed, but he didn't move, just watched her with those dark, unreadable eyes. Sarah climbed the ladder to her loft, but sleep was impossible. She lay on her blankets, staring at the rough boards of the ceiling, her mind racing. Below she could hear Tahoma moving around, the soft sounds of him banking the fire and spreading his own blankets. She thought about what he'd said, about not fighting alone. For 9 years she'd been alone, had convinced herself that she preferred it that way, that she didn't need anyone. But lying there in the darkness, listening to the quiet sounds of another person in her home, she realized how much she'd been lying to herself. The loneliness was a wound that had never healed, had only scabbed over, and now it was being torn open again. The second day passed much like the first. Tahoma and Quinai worked on her property, fixing things she'd learned to live with broken. They repaired her chicken coop, replaced rotted boards on the lean-to, even dug out her well a little deeper so it would last through the summer drought. Sarah cooked and cleaned and went about her business, but always she was aware of Tahoma, of his presence, his movements, his occasional glances in her direction. In the afternoon, as she was washing clothes in a wooden tub behind the cabin, Tahoma approached. He carried a bucket of water from the well and set it beside her without being asked. "Thank you," she said, surprised. He nodded, but didn't leave. Instead, he crouched down beside the tub, watching her work. It should have made her uncomfortable, his proximity, his attention. Instead, it felt natural, companionable. "Among my people," he said after a while, "women do this work. But they do it together in groups. They talk and laugh while they work. They are not alone. Among my people, too," Sarah said, wringing out one of her shirts. "Before I came west, I lived in Missouri. My mother and sisters and I would do the washing together every Monday. We'd gossip about the neighbors, talk about who was courting who, plan what we'd cook for Sunday dinner." She paused, remembering. "I haven't thought about that in years. You miss them. Sometimes. But they felt like different people from a different life." That's Sarah, the one who lived in Missouri and went to church socials and worried about what dress to wear, she died on the wagon trail west. The woman I am now, she was born here in this hard place. Tahoma was quiet, processing this. I understand. I too am not the man I was. The boy who rode free on the plains, who thought the buffalo would never end and the white man could be fought and beaten, he is gone. The man I am now, he knows the truth. And it is a bitter truth. Sarah stopped her washing and looked at him. Do you ever wish you could go back? Be that boy again, with all your illusions intact. Every day. But we cannot go back. We can only go forward into whatever future waits for us. That's a lonely thought. All truth is lonely, he said, and the sadness in his voice made her chest ache. They stayed like that for a while, neither speaking, both lost in their thoughts. Finally, Tahoma stood, picking up the bucket of clean water. I will carry this inside for you, he said, and she led him, watching his broad back as he walked away. That evening, Quinai announced that the horse was fully recovered and they would leave at first light. Sarah felt a pang in her chest at the news, though she told herself it was relief. These 2 days had been an aberration, a brief interlude in her solitary life. Tomorrow everything would go back to normal. But as she prepared their last meal together, a more elaborate affair than usual with precious stores she'd been hoarding, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was ending, something that had barely begun but that mattered nonetheless. They ate in near silence, the weight of the impending departure heavy in the air. Quinai excused himself early, giving them privacy with a knowing look that made Sarah's cheeks burn. Young he might be, but he wasn't blind. Sarah cleared the dishes, and Tahoma helped her, an unprecedented act that surprised her. They worked side by side at her wash basin, his hands enormous next to hers, his presence overwhelming in the small space. Thank you, she said when they were done, for all the work you did. The repairs will make my life easier. It was nothing, he said, but his eyes said differently. His eyes said it was everything. They moved to the fire, sitting in their now accustomed places. The flames danced between them, and Sarah thought about all the things she wanted to say but couldn't, all the feelings she didn't dare acknowledge. Sarah, Tahoma said, his voice rough, and something in her name on his lips made her breath catch. These 2 days they have been. He searched for words, his English failing him. They have been good. I have not felt peace in a long time. But here with you I have felt it. I know, she whispered because she did know, felt the same thing. For 2 days she hadn't been alone, and the relief of it was almost painful. I did not want to leave, he said, and the admission hung in the air between them, dangerous and thrilling. I know I must. My people, my band, they need me. I have responsibilities, duties, but I did not want to go. Sarah's heart hammered her chest. I don't want you to go either, she heard herself say, and couldn't believe she'd said it. Couldn't believe she'd admitted out loud what she'd been denying to herself. Tahoma leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his face intense. What are we doing here, Sarah? Tell me, because I need to understand. You are white, I am Comanche. Your people and my people, we are at war. This thing between us, it is impossible. I know, she said, tears pricking at her eyes. I know it's impossible, but that doesn't change the fact that I haven't felt this alive in 9 years. Doesn't change the fact that when you leave tomorrow, I'm going to feel more alone than I ever have before. He reached across the space between them, his hand engulfing hers. His skin was warm, calloused, his grip gentle despite his strength. I'm too old for this, he said, half laughing, half despairing. Too old to feel like a young warrior with his first woman. But that is how you make me feel. Sarah looked down at their joined hands, dark and light, calloused and strong. What do we do? She whispered. I do not know. I only know that I cannot leave you here alone. It feels wrong, like abandoning wounded on a battlefield. I'm not wounded. I'm strong. You said so yourself. Strength and woundedness are not opposites. The strongest warriors carry the deepest scars. He pulled her toward him slowly, giving her time to resist, to pull away. But she didn't. She leaned into him, crossing the space between them, and when their lips met, it was like lightning striking, electricity racing through her veins. The kiss was tentative at first, exploratory, two people learning each other. But it deepened quickly, 9 years of loneliness and 3 years of grief pouring into it from both sides. His hands came up to cup her face, gentle despite their size, and she clutched at his shoulders, afraid she might fall if she let go. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. "This is insane," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "This is completely insane." "Yes," Tahoma agreed, wiping her tears with his thumb. "But sometimes insanity is all we have." They sat together for a long time, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching the fire burn down to embers. Neither of them spoke about what would happen in the morning, whether he would leave or stay, whether this moment was the beginning of something or the end. Finally, exhaustion claimed them. Sarah climbed to her loft, and Tahoma spread his blankets by the fire. But she couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about the weight of his arm around her, the taste of his lips, the impossible situation they'd found themselves in. When dawn came, pale and hesitant through her window, Sarah descended the ladder to find Tahoma already awake, standing at the window, staring out at the empty prairie. Quinai was outside. She could hear him readying the horses. "You're really leaving," she said, and it wasn't a question. He turned to face her, and the torment in his eyes nearly broke her. "I have to. My people, my band, they depend on me. I am their war chief, their leader. I cannot abandon them for." He gestured helplessly between them. "For this, no matter how much I want to." Sarah nodded, forcing herself to be strong, to not beg him to stay. "I understand. Duty matters. Honor matters. But," he said, taking a step toward her, "I will come back. If you will have me, I will come back. I cannot stay always. My life is not my own. But I can come when I can, bring you supplies, help with the work. If you want this, if you want me." Sarah's throat was so tight she could barely speak. "Yes," she managed. "Yes, I want that. I want you." He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. She clung to him, memorizing the feel of him, the smell of leather and smoke and horse, and something uniquely him. "I will come back before the first snow," he promised in her hair. "I swear on my life, on my honor. I will come back to you." They stood like that until Quinai called from outside, saying the horses were ready. Tahoma released her slowly, reluctantly, his hands trailing down her arms until only their fingertips touched, and then nothing. He gathered his weapons from where they'd been stacked by the door, checked his supplies. At the threshold, he paused, looking back at her one last time. "Be safe, Sarah McKenna," he said. "Do not let the loneliness consume you. Remember that you are not alone anymore, not truly. Someone is thinking of you, riding across the plains, counting the days until he can return. Be safe, Tahoma," she whispered back. "Come back to me." Then he was gone, mounting his horse in one smooth motion, and she stood in her doorway watching them ride away, just as she'd watched the others ride away 2 days before. But this time was different. This time, part of her heart rode away with them. The days that followed were the longest of Sarah's life. She threw herself into work, into every task she could find or invent, anything to keep her mind occupied. But at night, lying in her loft, the loneliness was overwhelming, worse than it had been before, because now she knew what it was like to not be alone, knew what she was missing. She talked to him sometimes, out loud, as if he could hear her across the miles. She told him about her days, about the coyote she'd scared off from the chicken coop, about the surprise thunderstorm that had soaked her while she was working in the garden. She told him about her fears and hopes, about the slow passage of time waiting for his return. Summer blazed on, hot and dry, the sun beating down mercilessly day after day. Sarah's skin darkened further, her body growing leaner and harder from the constant work. She fixed what Tahoma and Quinai had repaired, maintaining their work, taking pride in keeping things in good order as if that would somehow bring him back faster. 6 weeks after they'd left, she was hauling water from the creek when she heard horses approaching. Her heart leapt in her throat, and she dropped the buckets, running for her cabin and her rifle. But even as she grabbed it, she was looking out the window, counting riders. 2 of them, and one was unmistakably Tahoma, tall and broad on his paint horse. Sarah set down the rifle and ran outside, not caring about dignity or propriety or caution. She ran, and when Tahoma dismounted, she threw herself into his arms, and he caught her, lifting her off her feet, spinning her around. "You came back," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "You came back. I said I would," he murmured into her hair. "Did you doubt me?" "Every day. Every single day I doubted." He set her down but didn't release her, his hands framing her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Never doubt again. I will always come back to you." The warrior with him, a man named Peta, she learned later, diplomatically announced he would see to the horses, leaving them alone. Tahoma and Sarah stood in the dusty yard, holding each other as if they could make up for 6 weeks of separation in a single embrace. "How long can you stay?" she asked, afraid of the answer. 3 days, he said. "My band is camped 2 days north. I told them I was going to scout the army movements, and I will on my way back. But I wanted to see you first to make sure you were well." 3 days, she repeated, her heart sinking even as she smiled. Then we should not waste them. Those 3 days were a revelation. They worked together during the daylight hours, Tahoma helping with repairs and improvements while Sarah tended her garden and animals. They cooked together, ate together, talked for hours about everything and nothing. Peta kept a tactful distance, occupying himself with hunting and his own projects. At night, they sat by the fire, and gradually, hesitantly, their relationship deepened. Tahoma told her about his band, about the increasing pressure from the army, about the dwindling buffalo herds and the growing desperation of his people. Sarah told him about her childhood, about her family back east, about her dreams for this land that had never quite materialized. And slowly, inevitably, they moved from talking to touching, from touching to kissing, from kissing to more. On the 3rd night, Sarah invited him up to her loft, and what happened there was tender and passionate, and everything she'd forgotten existed in the world. Afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, Sarah felt something shift inside her. For 9 years she'd been surviving, existing, enduring. But now, for the first time, she felt like she was living again. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness, barely breathing, afraid to say it out loud, but unable to hold it in any longer. Tahoma's arms tightened around her. "And I love you, Sarah McKenna. Against all wisdom, against all sense, I love you." When dawn came, the parting was agony. But this time, it was tempered by knowledge, by the understanding that this wasn't the end but the beginning of something, however complicated and difficult that something might be. "I will come again," Tahoma promised, "as often as I can. And when winter comes, when my band makes winter camp, I will stay longer." Sarah nodded, forcing herself to be brave, to not cling to him like a child. "I'll be here," she said, waiting, and she was. Through the rest of that long summer and into the fall, she waited. Tahoma came when he could, sometimes for a day, sometimes for a week. He brought her supplies, things she needed that he traded for or took from army supply wagons. He brought her gifts, beautifully worked leather, beaded pouches, a warm buffalo robe for the coming winter. And each time he came, their bond deepened. They learned each other's languages, Sarah picking up Comanche words and phrases, Tahoma improving his English. They learned each other's ways, their beliefs, their customs. They argued sometimes about big things and small things, their different worldviews clashing. But they always found their way back to each other, always found common ground in the love that had grown between them. The other Comanche warriors who sometimes accompanied Tahoma accepted Sarah with varying degrees of skepticism and approval. Some clearly thought their war chief was making a mistake, getting involved with a white woman. Others saw her strength, her resilience, the way she'd earned her survival on this harsh land, and they respected her for it. As autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and orange, Tahoma came with news. "My band will make winter camp in the canyon 20 miles north," he told her. "It is sheltered, with good water and grazing for the horses. I will be there all winter, and I want you to come. Live with us, with me. You should not be alone here during the winter storms." Sarah's heart leapt at the offer. but fear followed quickly after. Your people, will they accept me? Some will, some will not. But I am war chief. My word carries weight. And you are strong. You will prove yourself to them as you have proven yourself to me. It was a momentous decision. To leave her cabin, her land, everything she'd fought to maintain for 9 years. To live among the Comanche, to truly become part of Tahoma's world rather than just touching the edges of it. But as she looked at him, at this man who had given her back her life, her joy, her hope, the decision was easy. Yes, she said, I'll come. They spent several days preparing. Sarah packed what she would need, secured her cabin as best she could against winter and against potential thieves. She arranged with a settler 20 miles south to watch over her property, paying him with some of the small amount of gold she'd been hoarding. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best she could do. On a crisp October morning, Sarah McKenna, mounted the horse Tahoma had brought for her, took one last look at the cabin that had been her home for 9 years, and rode north with the man she loved, toward a future she couldn't predict but was willing to embrace. The Comanche winter camp was larger than she'd expected, 40 or 50 lodges spread across a protected canyon with good water and abundant wood for fires. As they rode in, people stopped what they were doing to stare at the white woman riding beside their war chief. Sarah held her head high, meeting their gazes with calm dignity. She understood their suspicion, their hostility even. She was the enemy, or should be, that she came in peace, that their war chief loved her, that didn't erase hundreds of years of conflict and pain. Tahoma led her to his lodge, a large teepee near the center of the camp. Inside it was warm and comfortable, buffalo robes on the ground, weapons and supplies neatly stored. An older woman was there, tending the fire, and she looked up at Sarah with shrewd, assessing eyes. This is Namid, my sister, Tahoma said. She has kept my lodge since my wife died. Namid, this is Sarah, the woman I told you about. Namid rose slowly, her gaze never leaving Sarah's face. She said something in Comanche, sharp and questioning. Tahoma responded, his tone firm, and a rapid exchange followed. Finally, Namid nodded grudgingly and spoke to Sarah in halting English. You are welcome in my brother's lodge, she said, though her tone suggested Sarah was anything but welcome. You work hard. You be respectful. We have no trouble. Thank you, Sarah said, understanding that this was a test, a challenge. I will work hard. I will earn my place here. And she did. Those first weeks were the hardest of Sarah's life, harder even than her first winter alone in the cabin. She had to learn everything, Comanche ways of cooking, of tanning hides, of preserving meat, of keeping a lodge. The women watched her constantly, waiting for her to fail, to prove that she was weak, that she didn't belong. But Sarah had survived 9 years alone on the frontier. She was not weak, and she did not fail. She worked from dawn until long after dark, her hands raw and bleeding until they hardened. She learned the language, painstakingly memorizing words and phrases. She showed respect to the elders, deference to the warriors, kindness to the children. Slowly, grudgingly, the band began to accept her. The children were first, curious and less bound by prejudice. They would come to watch her work, giggling when she mispronounced words, teaching her games and songs. The women came next, some of them at least, recognizing in her the same strength and determination they themselves possessed. The men were hardest, especially the warriors who had lost family members to white soldiers or settlers. But Tahoma's status protected her, and gradually, as she proved herself useful and respectful, even they began to soften. And through it all, Tahoma was there, supporting her, defending her when necessary, loving her with a constancy that never wavered. At night they would lie together in the warmth of the lodge, and he would tell her she was doing well, that he was proud of her, that she belonged with him no matter what anyone else thought. Winter descended on the plains in earnest, bringing bitter cold and snow that piled in drifts around the lodges. But the camp was snug and well supplied, and there was a sense of community, of belonging, that Sarah had never experienced in her isolated cabin. For the first time in years, she was part of something larger than herself. As the days shortened and the nights lengthened, Sarah found herself settling into this new life, finding joy in things she'd never expected. The laughter of the children, the camaraderie of the women as they worked together, the stories told around the fires at night. She was learning not just to survive, but to live, to be part of a community, a family, even if that family was different from anything she'd known before. On the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, the band held a celebration. There was feasting and dancing, stories and songs. Sarah sat beside Tahoma, wrapped in her buffalo robe, watching the firelight flicker across familiar faces. Namit had finally warmed to her, teaching her skills with patience, if not exactly friendliness. The children climbed on her lap, begging for the stories she told of her own childhood. Even the hostile warriors had begun to nod to her in passing, acknowledging her presence. Tahoma's hand found hers under the robe, his fingers interlacing with hers. "Are you happy?" he asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. Sarah thought about it, really thought about it. She thought about her cabin, standing empty in the snow. She thought about her old life, 9 years of solitary survival. She thought about where she was now, surrounded by people, part of a community, loved by a man who saw her and valued her for exactly who she was. "Yes," she said, and realized with surprise that it was true. "Yes, I'm happy." "Good," Tahoma said, pulling her closer, "because I cannot imagine my life without you now. You have become as necessary to me as breath, as essential as water. I do not know how I lived without you." "You managed," Sarah said with a smile. "Just like I managed. But managing isn't living, is it?" "No," he agreed. "It is not." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the celebration, and Sarah thought about how strange life was, how unpredictable. A year ago, if someone had told her she would be spending the winter in a Comanche camp, in love with a warrior, accepted by his people, she would have thought them insane. But here she was, and it felt right in a way her solitary life never had. She had spent 9 years convinced that she needed to be alone, that she was better off without anyone else, that depending on others was weakness. But she'd been wrong. The real strength was in opening yourself up, in being vulnerable, in taking the risk of loving and being loved. As the fire burned down and people began to drift to their lodges, Tahoma stood and pulled Sarah to her feet. They walked back to their own lodge through the snow, their breath making clouds in the cold air. Inside, the fire was still burning, casting dancing shadows on the hide walls. Tahoma took Sarah's face in his hands and kissed her, deep and slow, and she responded with all the love and passion she'd been holding back for so long. "I want you to be my wife," he said when they finally broke apart. "In the way of my people. I want you to be mine, and I yours, for as long as we both live." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Tahoma. I want that too." They made love that night with a tenderness and intensity that left them both breathless, clinging to each other as if they could merge into one being. Afterward, lying in his arms, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here, all the pain and loss and loneliness that had led to this moment of perfect contentment. The winter passed quickly after that, days blending into weeks, blending into months. Sarah and Tahoma were married in a Comanche ceremony, with the whole band witnessing their union. It was nothing like the white wedding Sarah had imagined as a girl, but it was more meaningful, more real than any church service could have been. As spring approached, melting the snow and bringing new life to the prairie, the band began to prepare to break winter camp. They would scatter into smaller groups for the spring and summer, following the buffalo herds, raiding and trading and living the free life that was becoming increasingly difficult as more white settlers and soldiers moved onto the plains. Sarah and Tahoma talked long into the nights about what they would do. The cabin still stood empty but waiting. The band would be on the move, dangerous times ahead with increased military presence. They could not stay together always, but they would find ways to be together when they could. "I will come to you when I can," Tahoma promised, "and you will come to us when it is safe. We will make this work, Sarah. We must." And they did, though it was not easy. For the next 2 years, Sarah divided her time between her cabin and the Comanche band. Sometimes she would spend months at the cabin, tending her land, maintaining her property, living the solitary life she'd once thought was all she wanted. Other times she would ride with the band, living as Tahoma's wife, accepted now fully by most of the people, respected for her strength and her skills. It was a strange life, suspended between two worlds, fully part of neither, but finding a place that was uniquely hers. She learned to be flexible, to adapt, to find strength in the dual nature of her existence. But always, no matter where she was, there was Tahoma. When they were apart, she carried him in her heart, his image sustaining her through the lonely times. When they were together, whether at the cabin or with the band, they treasured every moment, knowing how precious and fleeting their time was. The world was changing around them. That much was clear. More settlers, more soldiers, more pressure on the Comanche to give up their way of life. Battles were fought and lost, treaties made and broken. The buffalo herds dwindled, and with them the freedom of the Plains tribes. But through it all, Sarah and Tahoma held on to each other, held on to their love. It was a small thing in the face of the great changes sweeping across the land, but it was their thing, their choice, their defiance against a world that said they shouldn't exist together. On a summer evening 2 years after they first met, Sarah stood in the doorway of her cabin, watching Tahoma approach on his paint horse. The sun was setting behind him, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. He dismounted and came to her, pulling her into his arms, and she held him tight, breathing in the scent of him, feeling the solid warmth of him. "I love you," she said, as she said every time they met, every time they parted, as often as she could because the words were too important to leave unsaid. "And I love you," he responded, as he always did, his deep voice rumbling through his chest into hers. "More than the sky, more than the earth, more than freedom itself. You are my heart, Sarah McKenna, and as long as it beats for you." They stood together as darkness fell over the prairie, two souls who had found each other against all odds, who had chosen love in a world full of hate, who had built a life together despite everything that said they shouldn't. And if that life was unconventional, if it was difficult, if it required more strength and courage than most people possessed, well, that was all right, because they had each other, and in the end, that was all that mattered. The prairie stretched wide and empty around them, the sky vast above, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its mate. Sarah listened to Tahoma's heartbeat, steady and strong, and smiled. She had spent 9 years alone, convinced she needed no one. But she'd been wrong. And now, wrapped in the arms of this warrior who had come to her in a storm and stayed in her heart, she finally understood what it meant to truly live, to truly love, to truly be whole. The storms would come again, she knew. The world would keep changing, keep pushing them in directions they didn't want to go. But they would face it together, two stubborn survivors who had found in each other the one thing they both thought they'd lost forever. Hope, love, home. And that, Sarah thought, as Tahoma led her inside their cabin, was more than enough.